Well, first of all, good morning, good afternoon, I guess. Hope Church NYC. It's such a privilege to be here this morning. Sorry, as I spill all the water everywhere. It's such a privilege to be here this morning. For those who don't know me, my name is Hal. And if we haven't had a privilege to meet, I hope we have a chance to meet. My wife and I, Carol, and our 3 kids have had the real privilege to be here now for almost 2.5, 3 years. And what a blessed community this is. If someone in the prior service asked kind of a little bit about where I was from. So I was born in Brooklyn, kind of native New Yorker, and I grew up in Staten Island. And I want to say that this morning because I know Drew, our pastor Drew, loves Staten Island. And I just want to put that out there. I welcome each of you to this beautiful borough on the, this free cruise from the Isle of Manhattan to the Isle of Staten Island to enjoy our magnificent cultural artifacts, the Snug Harbor, have some Danino's pizza, and have a cup of coffee. I'll get you some coffee. So, no, but I'm just kidding. But I just want to put that out there. Staten Island's a wonderful place, and I hope that you have a chance to visit. We got that on camera, right? I want to make sure Pastor Drew sees that. All right, well, today, if you've been with us for last few weeks, we've been talking about new beginnings, and we're going to dive into that in a second. But before we go there, we're going to talk about power for the powerless. But before we go there, I just want to go to this next slide. And if you have a chance, maybe you could take out your camera and maybe take a picture. I also have the privilege to serve as the missions director here. And I just wanted to show you a few things that are on the Church Center app that Brooklyn kind of shared before. A few things that you might participate in. That might be of interest to you. So a few things here. First, we starting at the end of this month, we're going to have Zoom, 30 days of prayer to pray for the Muslim world for Ramadan. For those who may know, starting at the end of this month, all through March, is Ramadan. It's one of the 5 pillars of Islam. It's a time when Muslims fast and pray. And I think it's an opportunity for Christians to learn more about what it is that our Muslims, brothers and sisters, believe. And so it's an opportunity to pray for different groups of Muslims around the world. And that's on Zoom. You can scan that. It'll happen every day for that month. The second thing is that Craig Fee, Pastor Craig, who is in our first service, is holding a missional discipleship course, answering the question of what does it mean to be sent. If you've ever thought about that, if you ever thought about what is your role as a missional person, how do I live intentionally? What does it mean for my life here in New York and my life around the world? Then I would encourage you to sign up for this class. It meets for an hour and a half on Thursdays at 8 o'clock for a couple weeks, starting in the middle of March. And then lastly, we are about to start applications for our Yucatan summer missions trip. If you'll remember, last year our church had the privilege to partner with a church there in Mexico. And we will be doing that again. Applications are open. The deadline is March 1st. There actually will be a Zoom informational session tomorrow at 8 p.m. It's all in the Church Center app. If you are interested, please go ahead and scan that and join that. Our sister Brooklyn will be leading that trip again as she did last year. Okay, with that being said, let's talk about power, because that's what we're going to be talking about today. In this series, we've talked about a lot of different things: new beginnings, new food, new birth. And today we're going to talk about power. Now, the Webster's Dictionary, if you look it up, and this is just one of the definitions here, it says the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or the course of events. And actually, when I was thinking about this, I thought, man, there's not a better topic than this one today. If you just look around what's going on in our world today, I don't know if you guys, have been following the news about, even in New York City, our own mayor, and again, I'm not getting into politics here. I don't want to get into politics, but I think if you've read either the New York Times or the New York Post or whichever one is kind of your cup of tea, you'll see that increasingly in society, right in this city and around the country and around the world, right? It's all about power. Who controls? Who influences? Who has the ability sometimes to really dictate what is to be done? Right? And I see that, we see that so clearly just even in the last few days with all this, all this stuff going on with the mayor and in Washington and all these things if you've been following the news. And I guess the question I would ask each of us is maybe we've been in that situation, right? Where maybe right now you're saying, yes, life is good. I have the power, whether it's in my work or in my school or in my family or in some relationship, this is me and I'm in a good position and I feel strong. I mean, I guess that's good. I hope we'd reflect on that today. Because what I wanted for us to think more about today, and as we dive into this passage, is the opposite. If we go to the next slide, is this idea of powerlessness, if you will, being powerless. Because I would say that probably more often than not, that's how many of us feel. We feel powerless, right? We feel like there's a situation in our life that we don't know what to do, that we can't do anything. We feel hopeless. We feel at a loss. We feel lost. We struggle. Oftentimes, I would say we are more often than not feeling powerless. I was just reflecting on where was that, where is that in my life? And I could think of just like, recently we saw those fires in Southern California, right? Devastating, destroying neighborhoods. And I can only imagine if I was one of those homeowners or people living in that area, just this sense of feeling powerless, like as this fire sweeps down and there's just really, nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do except get out of there. And I just felt a little bit of it because as some folks may know, I have 3 kids. One of my kids goes to school in LA and his school was like right in the middle of that fire. Right? There was the big Palisades fire, unfortunately, that burned down so many houses. And if you remember, there was also for a few days a fire in the Hollywood Hills. Right? You remember that there was worry that the Hollywood Hills sign would go on fire and these kind of things. And his school is just like right in between there. And I remember that was a Thursday night because that fire was burning and this fire was burning. And I was just that night at like 2 a.m. I was just thinking, God, what could I do? Could I do anything? What should we do? And I just felt a complete sense like of powerlessness, like lacking power to do anything, and thank God, God took care of that situation. But I think I think we can identify with that. And I don't know what it is in your life today in particular, but I would bet that there is something that you are struggling with that gives you a sense of lack of power. Whether it's, as I said, in our work, whether it's in a relationship, whether it's an unhealthy addiction, whether it's whatever it might be, something has control over us. And we feel often that we can't do anything about it. Now, the Bible has a lot to say on this. Even if we look from last week, if you remember, Pastor Drew was talking about in John 9 about the man who was born blind, right? And here you'll see that it says, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Like, there was nothing that this person did. He was just born, and this was his situation. Right? And if you remember that passage, it says nothing, it was nobody who sinned, but it was for the work of God might be displayed in this person's life. Amen to that. How amazing is that? And today, what we're going to look at is a similar passage. This is a famous passage. Even if you're not a Christian, you've probably heard about Lazarus and his being raised. And this kind of takes it a step deeper, because last week we were talking about blindness, but today, if you go to the next slide, as you see here, it says, Mary said, if you were here, Lazarus would not have died. Right? We're moving from blindness to kind of the ultimate reason for hopelessness, which is death. Now, I hope that today you came and I'm sorry, because you probably came and were waiting, wanting to hear kind of a light sermon. It's like, it's like the holiday weekend, and we just had Valentine's Day, and like something uplifting and cheery. And I'm sorry that we have to speak about death, right? But I guess that's the passage. And I'm just trying to speak from what we're reading, and it gets a little heavy. But let's talk about death. Because death is one of those critical things, because what you believe about death determines how you live your life, right? What you believe death to be has so many implications about what we do in life. It's probably the most important question that faces all of us. Like, what happens after this life? What happens in eternity? Right? And that's something that we're going to be thinking about today. For me, death, as I thought about it, we as I said, we grew up in New York, but I've lived, and Carol and I have lived all over the world, and we were not as in New York, but we came back partly because, we came back because my dad was ill. And I think for me growing up, one of my greatest fears was about something happening to my parents, like, the death of my parents. Like, even saying that is like, it kind of causes me to not feel good, right? And I think maybe many of us can identify with that. Like, when we're kids and you're growing up and your parents, maybe everything. And what has changed, I would say, is that's still true. What has changed for me is now that I'm a parent, what really keeps me up at night sometimes is my kids, right? And the death of a child is something that is it's just so terrible. Even just saying that, you always should think like, I'm sorry, this is really heavy today, but you should always think like, a parent should pass away before their child, right? And even recently, I'll just give you another example. My son, he came home for a little bit. He wasn't feeling well, and he was having, headaches and all these kinds of things. And it really impacted me because, we have unfortunately this history of brain cancers in our family. And all I could think of was like, man, that's what he has. This is what he has. I just felt so terrible. And thanks be to God, he came, he got all his testing done, he got his CT, everything, came out back, not being that. And I'm just thankful to God. But that sense of hopelessness, the day before he got his test, just sitting there, I'm just like, I dread, a feeling of dread, right? I think we can all, in some way, maybe have felt that. Now, what I want to say is that this passage in Lazarus kind of answers this question. It's like, God, are you in control? Like, do you have control over death? Are you in control of everything in this world? And I think what's amazing about this passage, that as we dive into it, is you'll see that, yes, God is in control. God is in control of life. God is in control of death, right? So if we go to the next slide, what you see here is this kind of almost amazing, kind of made for Hollywood, passage, right? Where Jesus, who was deeply moved, he came to the tomb. There was a stone. He said, take away the stone. You could imagine the stone being pulled away. And then in a loud voice, like, Jesus, Lazarus, come out. Right? And then you see this, can you imagine it? I tried to look for a picture, and there's so many pictures of like a mummy kind of wrapped up, and he's coming out, and he being freed. Like, what an amazing story. And the Bible tells us in this passage that so many people saw this and came and witnessed this miraculous resurrection, like this miraculous healing, bringing Lazarus back to life. How amazing, how authoritative, how wide and deep is the power of God, right? And look at what happened to Lazarus. But you know what? I think what we should come to realize as we study this passage is this passage, as amazing as the resurrection of Lazarus is, that's not the main point of this passage. You know, that's not the main point of this passage because, first of all, Jesus could have just snapped his fingers and he didn't have to go, right? The passage tells us he went and you know, but why did he do it that way, right? And also, like, Lazarus didn't live forever, right? He still died, right? In the next chapter, if you read in John 12, you'll read how he was reclining at the table. So maybe he lived a couple days, a couple weeks, a couple months, a couple years. But Lazarus is not alive today. So the point that I'm trying to make is that as amazing as this miracle was, to see Lazarus being resurrected and come back to life, and that wasn't the point. What was the point, right? If we look clearly in between verse 39 and 42 and 41, what you'll see is this. The point of Lazarus' death and this miracle was that Jesus said that through this difficulty and hardship and then miracle, what would happen? We would see the glory of God. We would believe, right? The whole point of this miracle, the way that it was set up, was so that we could draw closer to God. We, the people that are here, that are reading about it today, those people who were around and witnessing what happened to Lazarus, that they would know God more intimately, more deeply, that they would believe. And so I want to take that to us today. Like, what are those things that we feel powerless against? You know, we had talked a little bit about that. You know, is it something at your work? Is it a relationship with somebody in your family? You know, is it a financial situation? Is it an illness, or is it kind of, as we talked about before, as Brooklyn read about from Taylor, the social injustice that we see in this world that we just feel powerless to do anything about? Is it, an addiction or something that we cannot break ourselves from? And what I would say is, in this passage of Lazarus, what we see is that God did this miracle and raised him up. And I'm not here to say that in this addiction, like, God's gonna do this miracle and you're gonna, somebody's gonna be raised up. It's like God can do that in his will, in his wisdom. And lots of times he does, and sometimes he makes us wait. But I think the key thing from this, a few things that I would say in this sense, in this situation of being powerless, that I want you to be encouraged about today. And the first is this, right? Is that this is an opportunity, just like we see with the raising of Lazarus, for us to seek to know more intimately the God of miracles rather than just the miracles of God. Oftentimes we are, God, give us our miracle. I've heard that, in many places, and we just want that good, but we don't want God. We don't know what it means. We miss the opportunity to know the God of creation. And so if you're in that situation today, realize that it's an opportunity for us to think. Like, God, help me in this situation. I'm powerless. I don't know what to do. But it's an opportunity for you and I to not just grab that miracle, but to grab God. Right? Now, I'm not trying to make light. Some of the situations are so hard. I'm not trying to make light of the situation, but I would say look at it as an opportunity to know God. The second thing I would say is this, is if you, go to the next slide, please. If you are in pain and in hardship and having difficulty and feeling powerless, then be encouraged. Because it's in those times that we see God more clearly. Right? I just put this up from C.S. Lewis. It says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, and shouts in our pains. I would ask each of us, just think about your own lives. When is it that you actually drew closer to God, knew God more deeply? Is it in those good times? Is it in those good times? I think when I look back, and in the good times, we forget God. I forget God. I can do this. My bank account says I can do this. My position says I could do this. This relationship says that I can do this. We forget God. God is whispering to us, but in our pains and in our difficulties, God is shouting. I can say that I've experienced that very deeply. Folks may know that Carol and I had an opportunity to go abroad. We felt God's calling, and it was very clear. At least we thought. It was very clear. We felt like God saying, you should go. You do this, I'll be with you. So we took up and left. And then interestingly enough, 1 year in, I remember saying to Carol, we heard God wrong. I don't know what we heard before, but this is wrong. We shouldn't be here. Let's go home. Right? And, it was like the cross-cultural context. It was just trying to speak to people. It was just like not understanding how to function. But praise be to God, at that time, when you're in that situation, when I was in that situation, and again, granted, this is not life and death like we're talking about today, but for me, this was one of those things that caused so much anxiety. I would be up, I couldn't sleep. It was just so overwhelming, and I felt so powerless. And in those situations, what I realized is, I could do nothing except cry out to God. Cry out to God. God, I need you. I need you to help me to think through, what are we doing here? And thanks be to God, we were part of a community just like we're part of a community here. And those brothers and sisters helped us because we were studying Psalms. And I may have shared this before. I'm just going to put this back on. Psalms 23, a Psalms that we all know very well, probably. And I just want to highlight a few things. What does it say here? It says, the Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. Man, when things are good, when we lack nothing, what is that relationship? That relationship is God is out there. He's good. He is good. But what does this psalm tell us in verse 4? It says, when I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, or when I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil. Why? Because it says, you are with me. That change in that word is so consequential, right? When things are good and when we're beside green pastures and quiet waters, we kind of know God. He's out there. But it's in those fires of life, when we're walking through the valley of the shadow of death, that God becomes a you, me. That's when we know him. That's when we experience him. That's when, that depth of that relationship grows. And so thanks be to God. You can ask Carol, it was cry out to God. What could we do? And God God provided a miracle. Like, we ended up staying there for, 8 years. But that's not the point. It's not the point of the miracle. It's the point that I got to know God so much more deeply. I'm so thankful for that. I'm so thankful. And so if we go to the next slide, I would hope that we would all be encouraged today. That if you are experiencing that hardship, those difficulties, feeling like I am at wit's end, I don't know what to do, I can't do anything. And I hope we would, maybe that's not you today, but that happens to all of us at some point. Life is like that. We try to do everything we can to set up everything in its proper order so that everything is safe. And inevitably, this is what Tim Keller had said somewhere, it's like, inevitably something is going to ruin it. That's just life, right? Ultimately, everybody dies, right? If that's just what we're going to say. And if that's like, we're talking about death today. That happens to us all. Death comes to us all, as it says in Samuel. I want us to be encouraged then this morning and to be reminded, as the Apostle Paul wrote, that he said that, this is Jesus speaking to him, that in his hardship, in his weakness, when he was being, there was a thorn in his side, whatever that was, we don't know. But in that weakness, this is what Jesus said, my grace is sufficient for you. If you go back up, for my power is made perfect in weakness. My power is made perfect in weakness. Brothers and sisters, if you feel weak today, see that as an opportunity to draw closer to God. God is pulling you in. God is saying, come to me. Right? I want you to know me. Get to know him. This is an opportunity for us. Rejoice in that, even in these hardships. Now, the thing I thought was interesting about this verse is, I always said, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And I always thought, like, this is like, Paul's weakness. He's got his thorn in his side. But kind of as I've been reflecting on this verse, what's interesting to me is, my power is made perfect in weakness also applies to what Christ has done for us. In Christ's weakness, in his humility, in the way that he sacrificed, we see and experience his power. It's just like so countercultural about what we think about power today. Right? This idea that power is strong and power dictates and power is, oppresses or is over and has control. In the kingdom of God, the power of God is through weakness, is through giving up, is through sacrifice. And where do we see that? We see that in this passage. If we go to the next slide, in John, at the beginning, we didn't read this verse. This is at the very beginning of John. But what it says here in John 11, it says that this sickness won't end in death. He's talking about Lazarus, but it is for God's glory that God's Son may be glorified through it. And I think if we first read this passage without reading subsequently, we might come away thinking, oh, yeah, God's Son's going to be glorified. Jesus is going to be put on a pedestal because of this amazing healer who, look at Jesus, look what he can do, look how awesome he is. That the whole passage is just about lifting up Jesus and look at his power to heal. But what we see, if we really dig into this, is that's not what it's about at all. If you look at chapter 12, just one chapter down, the same words, Jesus replied, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. What did that mean, for Jesus to be glorified? It wasn't that, hey, look how amazing this Jesus, this healer is, and put him on a pedestal. No, it meant his death on a cross. If we go to the next slide, what you'll see is in John, again, we didn't read this specific passage, but it happened right after. By healing Lazarus, by raising Lazarus up, Jesus condemned himself to die. Because what you see here is in 45, it says, wow, people saw this. The Bible tells many people saw this amazing Hollywood resurrection, this raising of Lazarus, and had seen what Jesus did and believed in him. But they went to talk to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. And so from that day on, they plotted to take his life. By raising up Lazarus, Jesus condemned himself to death. And so the takeaway here, if you go to the next slide, is that Jesus became powerless so that we could know God's power. That's the God that we serve. It's not about the miracle. I mean, the miracle is awesome, right? The miracle is amazing. The miracle shows God's authority and dominion and power over life and over death. And if he can take care, if he has power and dominion over death and life, why could he not take care of everything else in this world? He can. That's what he's showing through this miraculous raising. But that's not the point. The point of the raising is so that we could know God more deeply. We could experience God's glory. We could experience God's power. Jesus became powerless in the eyes of the world. Somebody who would die, who would get crucified. And yet that's the countercultural power of Jesus. That in weakness, there is strength. In his weakness, he shows us his ultimate grace. In our weakness, we have strength. I just want to end on this last verse again. I had put this up there before. This is from 2 Corinthians. It's from Paul. What he says about his weakness, his difficulty, which, again, we don't know specifically what it is, but this is what he said. And this is a reminder to us. I'm just going to read it because I think the words speak for themselves and are so powerful. It just says, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong." This is the message of the gospel, of power, of what it means to be powerless. But because we are powerless, we can experience God's grace even more fully. And I would pray that each of us, as we reflect on this, I would pray that we could take this home today and reflect on our weaknesses, our difficulties. And yet, because of that, we can experience God's power and God's strength.